Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers. This is Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times Podcast, and I'm delighted to be here today with Chris Genovali, who is a leading conservationist, a prolific writer, and a major voice for the voiceless creatures in British Columbia. Chris has recently been involved in a hugely successful campaign that stopped trophy hunting of grizzly bears throughout the vast province of British Columbia. Thanks for taking the time today, Chris.
Thanks so much, Louisa. It's great to be with you.
Chris, maybe you can share a bit about the Raincoast Conservation Foundation, your group that's been at the heart of the grizzly bear protection campaign.
Sure. Raincoast is a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by our research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. We were founded in 1996, and the tools that we use to further our conservation objectives include rigorous peer-reviewed science, public education, and community engagement. And we have termed this approach informed advocacy, and we think it's pretty unique among conservation efforts.
So you got your sea legs in activism in the conservation arena in the clear-cutting protests, which were huge, of Clackett Sound. Can you share just a bit about that campaign, or maybe what you learned there that you've carried forward since that time?
Well, if I was going to sum it all up, I would tell you that what I learned was if you're not prepared to go all in for the long haul, you should probably find something else to do with your life. Find another career.
Right.
You know, these campaigns are on really long time horizons, much longer than most people realize. And you know, the decision point for these issues often seems like it's occurred fairly rapidly, but when you just dig beneath the surface, you see that it's taken years and years of work to come to that point. And so you have to have a lot of perseverance, a lot of commitment, and not give up easily. You know, and there's a quote from Winston Churchill that I think is relevant, and you know, he said, and I might be paraphrasing here, but I'm not sure I can remember the exact words, but success is not final, failure is not fatal, and it's the courage to continue that really counts. So I'll just finish with this advice a First Nations friend of mine gave me. He's an elder from the north coast of British Columbia, and we'd been talking about the grizzly hunt campaign here, and because it had many stops and starts. And he said, "It's a beautiful battle," and I think what he meant was it's all about the process and the effort and the commitment, and you just have to let go of the expectations because you have no control over those in a lot of cases.
Right. That's beautiful. Well, yeah, the striving is all, it seems. So from our standpoint in the lower 48 states, it looks like British Columbia has a lot of grizzly bears. Government estimates, which may be off a fair amount, say there may be 15,000 grizzlies in the province, and that yielded an annual hunt that was going on until now of 250 to 300 bears a year. So was that relatively large number of grizzly bears a problem that you had to get over in your campaign?
I think it was only a problem in terms of the government wrapping themselves around that number and using it as justification for continuing the hunt and claiming it was sustainable.
Right.
that figure, I would say, is highly questionable. And I mean, all of their population estimates that they've put out over the years. Just to give you an idea, I mean, a little over 20 years ago, their estimates stood at 6,000 to 7,000 grizzlies. Then about, I don't know, maybe 10 years later, they upped it to 10,000 to 13,000. Now it's 15,000. And I'll just I'll quote Dr. Brian Heracy, who you may know.
Yeah. Yes.
He's got 4 decades worth of grizzly bear research experience, and has looked at this issue quite a bit. He says that the BC population estimates have no foundation in science and are, quote, primarily paper exercises extrapolating numbers from radio telemetry study areas, unquote. So I think there's reason to question them. But aside from that, the issues that resonated with people really, were beyond just numbers and whether or not you could take a certain number of grizzlies out of a population for the purposes of trophy killing.
Yeah. So, Chris, you were involved in a major part of your work was educating the media and thereby the public. And your media work I've been watching over the years, it's unparalleled. You use awesome photographs, you film, you've got pithy blogs that are understandable by top-notch scientists. You've got lots of fascinating events that the media picked up on. And your argument that bears are worth more alive than dead had enormous resonance with the public. And you had partnerships with companies like Lush Cosmetics and Denman Island Chocolate that made a chocolate bar, especially for this purpose of helping the campaign. Can you describe what you did with these businesses and with your media efforts in general?
Well, I guess part of it was the fact that many of the businesses that we worked with in the ecotourism industry, wildlife viewing industry, are dependent on healthy populations of large carnivores. I mean, it's a burgeoning business on the coast of BC. They attract people from all over the world, paying large amounts of money to come here to see our grizzly bears, our black bears, our wolves, cougars, the white spirit bear, and so they had an inherent interest in seeing this activity halted and the management of grizzly bears reformed, and so it was a natural kind of relationship to build, and we started to work with them very closely and helped them in the early stages become a business voice on this issue, which is powerful. And as well, there's other businesses within British Columbia that recognize that there's no ecological, no economic, no ethical reason to be killing these bears for trophies, but I think they also understood that these bears bring an incredible kind of cachet to British Columbia and draw people here and are important to not only the ecological landscape, but in terms of the economy and the culture of how people see British Columbia and what makes it attractive for both tourists and business. And so, like you mentioned, Denman Island Chocolate's a local company that makes these incredible organic chocolate bars, created the Grizzly Bar. It was a great kind of PR tool that we used to get the word out. And Lush Cosmetics, they've been just, their support has just been stunning, both in terms of, supporting what we're doing from a donation perspective, but also helping to amplify the message to they've got an incredible network throughout North America with their stores, and they utilize that to great effect.
Yeah, absolutely. So you just talked about the attractive parts of British Columbia and how you got these businesses involved, but there is also a really dark side of your media efforts. And there was one video I remember seeing that I think you released of two hunters blasting away at this beautiful grizzly bear that tumbles down the snowfield that leaves it fully, blood red, and it's just unbelievably shocking and awful. And you had that side of your campaign. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that sort of brutal aspect too.
Sure, and that was actually another group had gotten a hold of that footage and leaked it, but it definitely shocked people, and I think it speaks to the ethical and moral issues around trophy hunting, and especially of large carnivores, because one of the things that I think was reflected in all of the polls that have been carried out, for 20 years, which show a strong majority of British Columbians wanted this stopped, is the ethics of this. Why are we going out and killing these animals for no other reason than to satisfy people's egos, for recreational purposes, for sport? And I think, bringing the whole issue around ethics into the debate was something that we pioneered, and something that Dr. Paul Paquette, our senior scientist, really led the way on, and was able to speak to this in an incredibly insightful and articulate manner that I think touched a lot of people. And it's there's a qualitative difference between legitimately hunting for food and what we call real hunting, and hunting for trophies. And there's just you just cannot justify killing any large carnivores as being something that is necessary or that is not anything other than gratuitous. And I think that is resonating with British Columbians to a great degree. And now that the grizzly hunt has been halted, people are starting to realize that there's other species like wolves and cougars and black bears that are subject to this as well. Right.
Well, you just mentioned Dr. Paul Paquette, and indeed he's one of my heroes, also Chris Darrimont. I've been amazed at your skillful use of science in your work, just your work generally, and the fact that you've got Chris Darrimont, who works with you, also has a faculty position at University of Victoria that houses something called the Raincoast Lab, where you have enormous number of projects of scientists taking on different aspects of ecology and population biology and perspectives on science and the trophy hunting issue. We don't have anything like that down in the lower 48 states, and around Yellowstone we only have this federally funded interagency grizzly bear study team, which is all about promoting the status quo, not challenging it as you were doing. Maybe you can describe how you built up your science efforts, and if you have any recommendations for us in the U.S.
Well, from the beginning it was a deliberate strategy. We wanted to be to kind of set ourselves apart by being a truly science-based organization that just didn't pay lip service to science, but actually carried out primary science on the ground, on the water, and was publishing in peer-reviewed journals. And Paul Paquette was a huge part of that. He's kind of been our guru in terms of our approach to science, and helped us really build that. And Chris was actually one of his students, and
right.
Paul had been mentoring him, and Chris ended up interning for us, and then it was pretty quickly we realized what an incredible talent Chris Darramont was, and he started to work for us, and so he and Paul have really led the way around our focus on science and also the establishment of the Raincoast Lab at the University of Victoria. We negotiated that with the university back in 2012, and we brought over a dozen years of cutting-edge science on large carnivores to the table, and we're able to attract funders as well to partner with the university. So it was, something that we saw as a natural evolution of our science focus, and that would give us even more kind of street cred when it came to science and research, and that we would be able to kind of leverage the intellectual and physical resources of the university by creating this partnership and creating the Raincoast Lab.
Yeah, it's amazing. You also had a different kind of partnerships with First Nations, the indigenous peoples in British Columbia, and that proved to be really important to the success of the campaign. And First Nations people also are doing really important research on the ecology of salmon and bears and wolves. And how did you forge relationships with First Nation leaders, and why do you think ultimately those voices mattered in British Columbia and Canada more generally?
Well, those relationships are long-term relationships that we've built being in those communities on the Central and North Coast, and working together in partnership, collaborating on that research that you referenced. We've had a couple of different long-term projects that have helped facilitate establishing those kind of relationships when you work closely together and out in the field, and Chris led a decade-long wolf research study that we partnered with the Heiltsuk First Nation with, and then other nations. And then that when that was concluded, we started this bear salmon research project that has been a multi-year ongoing study. We're working with 5 different First Nations in formal partnership on that, and it's I think it's also a recognition. I mean, we saw this incredible generation of leaders emerging from all the communities there, maybe 10 or so years ago. And all of these people like Doug Niesloss and Jess Housty and William Housty just have become the leading voices on a lot of these issues, and not just in their communities, but for the entire province. I mean, they are really leading the way in terms of creating a vision and putting pressure on government and articulating why Coastal First Nations were so opposed to this, in terms of it being antithetical to their values, violation of tribal law, and also that they had concerns around the impact to the growing economy that they have in their communities around wildlife viewing. For instance, in Doug's community in Clem 2, the Kitasoo First Nation, it's just an incredible success story with their ecotourism business there, and the beautiful lodge that they built, and
Wow.
The amount of employment it creates and the kind of quality, good jobs. And so, I mean, we are, humbled and honored to be able to have worked with them so closely on this issue. And it's been a powerful relationship.
Yeah. Well, as you may know, we've got tribes down in our part of the world, 200 strong now across the country, who've signed a treaty opposed to trophy hunting of grizzly bears around Yellowstone and Glacier. A huge number of tribes and a real upwelling of concern about an animal they feel is a relative. They have long seen it, same as in your part of the world, bears as relatives that we shouldn't be putting their heads on walls. But we have a long way to go to make ecotourism a real going concern, if you will, around communities, around the reservations in the Northern Rockies. So I think your First Nations are really leading the way, not just in terms of research, but also in terms of making an ecotourism economy work. So. Yeah,
and also I think maybe a distinction here as well is the legal precedents that have been set and through court challenges and the kind of influence, both political and legal, that First Nations have here now. And I think any government at any level has to pay attention to that in this day and age in British Columbia and Canada, because it's a reality that needs to be acknowledged. And so that First Nations here are kind of rapidly regaining agency over conservation, and stewardship and land use and marine use, and so it's that's the dynamic at play.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And, of course, as the delisting of Yellowstone grizzly bears, has been publicized, and there are many lawsuits around trying to get grizzly bears relisted or federal protections restored to Yellowstone bears. We also have 17 tribes engaged in a serious court case of the decision itself. So we may not have the legal precedents and the power of them that you do in Canada, but we certainly have tribes that are taking that route and trying to see if it can provide important leverage for tribal voices. So you have in British Columbia a really important urban base of support in Vancouver and Victoria, and that certainly helped stop grizzly bear trophy hunting. And we're also seeing in the interior West, on both sides of the border, are becoming increasingly urbanized, big urban centers of Boise now and Missoula and Great Falls and the like. And this could shift the debate in favor of conservation. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the trends that you saw in British Columbia and, maybe share what you think they portend for conservation.
Well, it's interesting here because the polling has indicated that the kind of opposition to the grizzly hunt was across the board, both kind of politically and socially in a lot of ways. And obviously, like you said, the urban centers, Vancouver and Victoria, are pretty clearly on side with that issue. But the polling indicates that a majority of the hunting community was actually opposed to it, and so I think it's there's a distinction that needs to be made between, as I was mentioning before, shooting large carnivores for trophies and just hunting in general. And we think that there's a lot more to be done in that area, and that really the problem exists more in the leadership, a lot of this sport hunting lobby, than it does with the rank and file hunters who are members of these organizations.
Right.
And I think part of it is it's just a resistance to change. It's also there's a bit of almost paranoia that once one domino falls, they're all going to fall, and
right.
Nobody's trying to take away anyone's right to go out and hunt deer and put meat in the freezer. It's this kind of gratuitous killing that we're opposed to, and
right.
And I do think that resonates to the urban base to a large degree. I mean, people just don't understand, what is the need to go out and kill one of these magnificent animals, because there's no sport involved in killing these animals. I mean, there's no fair chase, especially on the coast. I mean, it's a search and destroy mission, and
oh God.
So, that term was actually, to describe the coastal hunt, was actually coined by Brian Heracy and Gary Gilbert and Lance Craighead in a report that they did.
Oh,
and
yes.
I think it was, it was quite accurate, because if you spend any time on the coast of British Columbia, where these grizzly strongholds, in the spring, they're sitting out there on the estuaries, feeding on grasses and
right.
They're just sitting targets in the fall and the other hunting season. They're congregating around salmon streams and just intent on fattening up for the winter, and they're often in hyperphagia, and they're groggy, and it just it's not right. And I think people see that, and and then they find it abhorrent, to be honest. Right.
Yeah, and the horror just wasn't in Canada, but extended to Europe. And something I found really fascinating related to your campaign. So back in 2001, you were able to secure for a brief time a moratorium on grizzly bear hunting. And then we saw this European Union ban on importing grizzly bears from British Columbia. How did the European Union get involved, and why does what they say and do matter in British Columbia?
Well, we were able to get, this is one of the stops and starts, we were able to get a province-wide 3-year moratorium put in place back in 2001 on the grizzly hunt. It lasted one spring hunting season. There was an election. The new government came in, and the first thing they did, the first policy decision, not just environment or conservation policy, but just policy in general, was to revoke the moratorium. And so we started to pivot to look at other ways of dealing with this issue and impacting it. And one of the things that we had figured out was, a lot of the client base for guide outfitters in British Columbia was from Europe, and especially in terms of grizzly hunting, it was in Austria, Germany, a couple of other countries. And so we started working with a couple of groups in the UK and Germany, Environmental Investigation Agency, and primarily, and started to put together the case to go to the EU and request a ban. And our science staff was heavily involved in putting together that information, and worked with other folks like Barry Gilbert and Brian Heracy and some other people, Wayne McCrory, and so we went through the process and appealed to the EU, and their scientific review group deemed that it was unsustainable and that BC was not meeting its stated commitments and around grizzly bears, and so they put the ban in place, and that shut down a huge kind of pipeline of clients for a lot of the guide outfitters on the coast that were highlighting grizzlies as part of their hunting package, and the government, both in BC and the Canadian federal government, were quite upset about this. I remember being on the phone with the federal environment minister and just having to hold it away from my ear because he was screaming about what an embarrassment this was for Canada, and I just wanted to tell him, hey, what's embarrassing is that we continue to allow grizzly bears to be shot and killed for trophies, and
right, exactly.
So anyway, there were challenges to that EU ban. There were several of them, and they were upheld each time, and it's still in place now. So
it's still an embarrassment.
But it also had the other effect of it was, and this was kind of another part of our agenda, was we had started to look at, could we actually buy one or more of these commercial hunting tenures, these territories that guide outfitters were using. And we figured that if we could kind of turn the taps off of their main client base, it might make them more amenable to talking about selling. So that was also part of the strategy.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, maybe you can explain a little more about how it was that you bought up and retired these hunting leases on, I guess, provincially on land. It was a huge amount of money and a huge amount of acreage that meant closing off hunting to grizzlies. It seemed like you were well on your way of closing off most of the coast to grizzly bear hunting, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how that strategy evolved.
Well, after the new provincial government in 2001 had overturned the moratorium, we were pretty frustrated. We'd put a lot of time and effort into that, and there was no logical reason why they overturned it. It was obviously a quid pro quo with the trophy hunting lobby. So anyway, we thought, okay, we need to get creative and start to look at ways we can impact this issue without relying on government, at least the BC government. And so I started to look at how land conservancies operated, how they would buy land and, set it aside for protection. And I went down and spoke to the local folks at the Nature Conservancy Canada office in Victoria and just asked them, how they did it, and kind of floated this idea by them, because I had done some research and found out that these commercial hunting tenures could be bought and sold. And the people I talked to there said, this it looks like it could be workable, but it would be an experiment, and in any case, we decided we would try to buy one, and we picked we picked one of the largest ones on the Central Coast, in the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest, 24,000 square kilometers. It's huge, and this guy had a large grizzly quota, one of the largest on the coast. He was killing a lot of wolves. He was kind of taunting us with that, actually. Oh yeah, because he knew we were doing this wolf study, and so anyway, we had started to create the conditions, with the EU ban and the pressure in the media and so forth, where we felt we could approach and start a discussion. And so we negotiated with the individual that owned this particular tenure. We agreed on a price, $1.3 million. We had to raise that money in 12 months.
Ouch.
And we did, and we shut down all the commercial trophy hunting in that vast region. And the thing is, when you buy these territories, it is in perpetuity in essence, because as long as you're maintaining your all the things that you're obligated to as an owner, you own them until you decide if you wanted to sell them, right? Because they get bought and sold all the time.
Wow.
And so we bought that one. Then a few years later, we purchased a second one, a smaller territory, but still quite large, about 3,500 square kilometers, which was in the heart of spirit bear habitat.
Oh, yeah.
And so, it's illegal to shoot the white spirit bear for trophy, but you can kill the black bears that carry the recessive gene that's responsible for producing the white spirit bear. So that was one of our motivations in buying that one. So we bought that one, and then we recently, a couple of years ago, we bought a third one. So we're up over, I think we're around 32,000 square kilometers, and I think that's equivalent to, in size of, or it's larger than Yellowstone. I think it's like 2 or 3 times the size of Yellowstone. So it's a large area. You don't actually own the land; you own the hunting rights. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and we're targeting a fourth one right now. We're in the midst of fundraising for that. It's just in the kind of prime area of the Great Bear Rainforest, and we want to buy all the remaining ones. There's about 5 more left after this current one that we're looking for. Huh. Even though the grizzly hunt is, there's a ban in place now. It's always been our goal to shut down all large carnivore hunting in the Great Bear Rainforest, and so that's the goal we continue to pursue. And
right. That's an amazing strategy, an amazingly successful effort. You've had, some of your strategies were maybe a little more conventional in terms of court cases and the like, and one that was interesting to me was a successful battle that you had over getting data on hunted bears from the British Columbia government. And that case went to the British Columbia Supreme Court, which is a really big deal. Why was this data so important to your efforts, and why did the British Columbia government fight releasing the data?
So we wanted the grizzly kill data because as part of our initiative to investigate and analyze and challenge the science that the provincial government had kept throwing out there, we needed this data and to be able to do that. And all of these bears are being killed on Crown land, public land. We felt this was also an issue just fundamental to the freedom of information law here, and that, in any case, we launched, it started with an FOI request and then ended up in a 5-year legal battle in court on various levels in British Columbia. Like you said, it went to the Supreme Court, and the government was arguing along with the trophy hunting lobby that this information was proprietary, and that which was just outrageous. That you can carry out this activity on public land and then withhold the information from the public. And we didn't want this information to compete with commercial guide outfitters bringing trophy hunters out onto the landscape. We wanted to do some independent science, and in any case, it was really a precedent-setting victory, and Ecojustice just did a magnificent job as our legal counsel throughout this whole process. And one of the reasons why it's so important and has proved to be so important is that a lot of the work that Chris Darmont and Paul Paquette and another one of our large carnivore scientists, Kyle Artell, have done is really attributable to being able to have the grizzly kill data that we were able to access through this win in the courts. And there was a paper that Kyle was the lead author on, Paul and Chris were on as well, that came out a couple of years ago in PLOS One. It was really one of the watershed papers that have been published. It was the first peer-reviewed paper on the management of grizzlies in British Columbia, I believe. And it showed, widespread overkill was happening.
Right.
And, highlighted the uncertainty around a lot of the numbers that the provincial government was using. So it's been a kind of a long process, with from the start of the court case and going forward, but it's had a lot of application to a lot of different things that have been very important to the Grizzly campaign.
Yeah, interesting. So you were able to make and integrate a campaign with media components, with court efforts, with economic attributes, and work with First Nations and others. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you were able to really make progress or success with the British Columbia election, so that when the NDP got in power, they immediately announced a hunt ban. We've never been able to make grizzly protection in the lower 48 states an election issue. How did you do that?
I think it's almost like a critical mass.
Right.
The issue has been in the media, in the public eye. Numerous NGOs. As we spoke about before, coastal First Nations, hammering away at this issue for a long time. The business sector. I think it's because it remained unresolved, and there was no way this was just going to go away. And it's also it is a business issue. I mean, in 2003 we did an economic study looking at comparing revenues for grizzly bear viewing and killing grizzly bears on the coast. And back then it was, viewing them was bringing in twice as much money to the province as killing them. Coastal First Nations commissioned a report several years later. It was a think tank at Stanford University, and they found that the viewing grizzlies was bringing in 10 to 12 times or more the amount of money than the hunt. So it was also something that I think the parties that were involved in the election had to address, because the economics and the business voice around this had become so prominent. And that was one of the stated, reasons that the NDP spoke about when they made the final announcement on the grizzly hunt, was around the economics of this, and that how much more lucrative viewing these animals was than killing them. Yeah.
Right. So, Chris, maybe you can just speculate for a minute what you think some of the broader implications are of this huge victory in Canada and maybe in the U.S. or elsewhere.
I think it's one of the things that we are hoping this will be is a springboard to looking and examining and challenging the hunting of all large carnivores. In British Columbia, sometimes I think BC stands for bloodbath for carnivores because
oh dear.
if you look at the numbers, I mean, it's staggering. Like over 1,200 wolves a year are killed from hunting and trapping, and that's probably, these figures are all probably conservative because the reporting isn't very robust.
Right.
And in terms of how many black bears are killed, I mean, it could be anywhere from 1 to 4,000. It's just enormous.
Wow.
250 to 300 cougars. It just goes on, and we need to do something about this.
Right.
Also, I think we're hoping it's going to be, the grizzly hunt announcement is going to be a springboard for pushing to reform wildlife management in general.
Right.
I think that's been...
Well, we've got that.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say wildlife reform, management of wildlife is just a completely broken system, I think, in both countries. We have these incredibly charismatic animals, and yet we basically gun them down without looking at the broader implications. So hopefully it'll inspire people down in the lower 48 states to take a look at carnivore management more seriously, too. I
hope so. And we actually just have an opinion piece in the Vancouver Sun today about the latest favor that Chris and Kyle and Paul have done on this, along with some other collaborators, around what they have termed political populations. And what they are finding is, jurisdictions around the world, not just in North America, but in Europe as well, almost manufacturing numbers for populations, or framing or spinning science to fit a political agenda.
Right.
And this is, I think this whole issue is going to be exposed in a big way in the coming years here. And hopefully this decision in British Columbia around the grizzly hunt is going to help, like I said, as a springboard to address, these larger issues around wildlife management.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, Chris, around Yellowstone, the state of Wyoming is moving forward to gearing up to sponsor its first grizzly bear hunt in 40 years with the recent delisting of the grizzly. The state's moving forward. Are there any final words of wisdom or lessons to us in the lower 48 states that you might share?
I would say don't automatically trust what government says in terms of their science or their wildlife management policies. I think it was Henry Kissinger, of all people, once said that power creates its own legitimacy. And I think that's why governments and agencies are able to get away with so much of the stuff they have been able to get away with, and making assertions that are not based on evidence or on good evidence. And I would say, keep challenging that and keep challenging their assumptions. And I think also don't be afraid to talk about the ethical side of these issues. I think that those are legitimate things to bring up. And if you think about it, what other realm of public policy, criminal justice, health, child care, like you could go on and on. None of them operate in a vacuum where you don't talk about ethics or morality, right? It only seems wildlife management is burdened with this kind of ridiculous restriction that you can't talk about ethics, and that's not right, and we need to change that.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Chris, and congratulations on this huge, important win of this grizzly bear hunt campaign. I'm speaking, Louisa Wilcox, and I'm speaking today with Chris Genovali with the Raincoast Conservation Foundation, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it.